everyone. Welcome to SoundWaves, Season 14. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Dan Graboy, and I put this series together. I list myself as the curator, whatever that means. But in my mind, what that means is there are so many brilliant people on our faculty, and if I can just rope them into giving talks to you guys that last 15 minutes and that shed some light on their area of expertise and research, then I guess I get the credit for being the curator, which is pretty great. This series has done well because the speakers are so absolutely brilliant. In the last few years, we've taken a topical approach to the entire season. We do 4 SoundWaves every academic year. And so this year, for the whole year, our theme is development, which is a great topic because basically everything develops. And so hence the strange title of the whole event, where I list the subjects that we're dealing with on this episode of development. And there's a calendar, I think, out there with all the other dates for SoundWaves events. So I really appreciate your coming, and we will get started right now with Michelle Wildgen.
Hello. Okay, let me just make sure I know how to do that. Okay, I know how to do this. So, hi everybody. My name is Michelle Wildgen, and obviously I'm going to talk about the development of a novel. I've written 4, but I want to talk about the most recent one, which is Wine People. And, you know, what I have learned over years of teaching and writing is that in order to be a productive anything creative, it's sort of this mix of working with the best habits of your brain, the things it likes, and working around all of the ways in which your own brain says, you can't do that, you don't know how to do that, nobody wants to do that. So that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. So in The Sun Also Rises, there's a character who is asked how he lost all of his money, and he says 2 ways, first slow and then fast. And I kind of think about that when I think about how Wine People began. It first started about 25 years ago because I was graduating from college here at UW, and I wanted to write about food, and I didn't know anything about food. So I got a job at L'Etoile and figured they would teach me. And it was transformative for a lot of reasons, but I'll focus in this case on how it introduced me to wine. So there was a lot of things that happened, but you know, we had these wine importer dinners where the winemakers, the importers would show up from Austria or Germany or wherever and talk about the wine that they made. And so I first began thinking like, oh, that's right, this is a thing somebody had to make. And it just acquainted me with that idea. But I still thought of wine as it is, as this very luxurious, refined, demanding product, and it is. But I remember a friend of mine who later, she worked with me at L'Etoile and she later went into the wine importing business, saying to me at one point, you know, these guys are farmers. And it always stuck with me that it was sort of this fascinating mix of a tension between a really refined product and just the brute hard work of actually having to make it. So it just stuck in my head the way these things do for many decades. And then a few years ago, I happened to be talking to, again, people in the wine importing business. It's going to sound like I just was, you know, hanging around with them all the time, but they were one specific group of people. And he was telling me about his job. And, you know, one of the things that you do when you're thinking or between novels is just like what catches your attention in everyday life. And what caught my attention was his description of working for this importer and the Monday morning meetings that they would have. And there were 2 things about it. One was that you could always tell who was sort of jockeying for position and who was competing with whom and all of these sort of undercurrents, and that's catnip to a novelist. We love that sort of thing. And he also said, and the other great thing about it is that all the sales reps kind of resembled their territories. So the Upper East Side guy was really stuffy, and like the downtown people were much cooler. And again, this is just like a wonderful characterization exercise. And so I started thinking about it and thinking, you know, maybe this is a world I want to look into. So as for why was this going to be the thing I was going to look into now, after this thing was, you know, bouncing around in my head for many years, there were a few reasons. One, I wanted to write something that was pleasurable to write, pleasurable to read. I had learned by now that I should follow the electricity, meaning the electricity that grabs my attention, even if I don't yet know what I'm going to do with it. And I thought that this would be a new world for me to look into. The one bit of context that, you know, some of the people in this room will know is that when I say I want to write a book that is fun to read and fun to write, I have tried to do this before. And what tends to happen is that as I dig in, I then start to say things like, maybe I should kill off somebody. Should I kill someone? And people in my writing group would be like, you don't have to. And I was like, how about a breakdown? Just a really debilitating breakdown. And this time I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to go into a world that is so full of pleasure and interest and yet work and conflict that I will be able to stop myself. So there are times when you know the story you want to tell, and you start casting around for the world you can set it in that will do the most interesting work. Other times, in this case, you know the world, or you're getting to know the world you're interested in, but until you know it well enough, you have no idea what the story will be. And that was the case for me. I just didn't know enough about what are the problems, what kind of people are in here, what are the career paths. So my first job was really to just start talking to people. And that was all I did for about 5 or 6 months, was I talked to anybody who had done anything, no matter how tangential, in the wine business who would talk to me. So that was everyone from people who had grown up in it, people who worked as chefs in vineyards, who were importers, salespeople, it didn't matter. And it was all fascinating, and that's always a good sign, right? It tells you that you were right on the money, that this is a thing that's going to interest you enough. That said, it's a controlled substance, so there is an extremely boring underbelly, and that is all of the bureaucracy. I didn't want to write about bureaucracy, and that's good, because you guys don't want to read about it. So I saved all of that for literally a book called How to Import Wine, which was like written for me. It was perfect. And that way, when I'm talking to these fascinating people, I don't have to ask them about tariffs and whatnot. I could just go to my very boring book and not have to spend that time with them. There was also some travel involved because the experiential part of this is actually really important. So I went out and visited a friend in California. And we spent some time in like the Central Coast, and we did a little mini version of what my wine importer characters do, which is going from winery to winery and tasting, and just getting a little hint of what it's like. And that was fascinating. And later I happened to go to Italy for something else, but I was with a friend who worked in wine, and she arranged for us to visit other wineries in Italy, and that also made it into the book. And then I did some very thoughtful, focused drinking. And that's actually really true. Like, I'm joking, but I'm not, because there were times when I would say, well, I want to have a character make a wine that is, unexpected for this varietal or for this place, or I would be describing this wine in my head, and I needed to have a little bit more of the vocabulary that an actual wine professional would have. So I was sometimes drinking and thinking carefully about, like, where did this come from? And of course, it was pleasurable. And then I stole a lot from my friend who had worked in this business. There's a lot of times when you ask people about their experience, and because they're not you, they don't give you everything you want, because they just don't notice the things that you notice, or they don't have the interest in the same things that you do. But in this case, it was as if this woman had lived her life waiting for me to steal it all and put it in a novel. It was wonderful. She remembered all the things I wanted her to remember, and she was fascinating. And I took my main character, whose name is Ren, from a lot of her background, which was somebody who'd grown up without a lot of advantages here in kind of the Madison area, and basically clawed her way into this business where she has made it happen through passion and determination, but never feels quite comfortable. So at this point, it's kind of gathering some layers, right? I've got a character, I've got my world, but to get a story going, you need a problem. And so I had to start thinking about what's going to give me something to work with here. Some of the best things that you can do, or one of the most necessary things you can do, is you need to give your characters trouble. And it can't just be any trouble. It has to be like a productive kind of trouble. And sometimes the best thing you can do is set up opposing forces. So if I have a character who's an outsider, it became clear that it was going to be useful to have a character who is an insider. So Ren is our outsider, and then I made up this woman, Thessaly, who is drawn from a little bit of the broad outlines of a winemaker named Jasmine Hirsch, who grew up in the business. And she's a golden girl in this business. She's always been in it. She feels completely comfortable in it. And she is sort of designed to make Ren feel as insecure as possible. One of the ways I often talk to my students about this is I say, we're not just poking at our characters. We are pressing on the right bruise. You have to figure out the thing that gives interesting story and is revealing of them. If we drop a piano on anybody, we're all going to get smashed the same way. That's not interesting. So you have to kind of cast around for what's going to work. And the next thing you need to start your story is, why is this day the day that this story begins? You can't start when it's like, well, it was any other day. No, something has to be different. And so I had to figure out what that was going to be. What it ended up being for me was that my two characters are working for a wine importing company, and the story begins the day that the sort of head guru guy says, you know what, somebody is going to have to take over for me sometime soon. And now we have a succession drama. And then that means that I am stuck having to finally start writing this book because I've been having a wonderful time doing research and just sort of thinking and noodling. And I am somebody, I'll talk more about this in a minute, who finds the first draft incredibly difficult. So the moment that I actually have to sit down and start writing a story feels to me like I have never even read a novel in my life. It's always baffling. But it's good that I know this about myself. There are people who know everything about their stories before they sit down. I once heard of somebody saying, you know, I thought my story was going to be 264 pages. It turned out to be 268 or something like that. And this is not how I think or do anything. I almost admire it. I'm terrified of it. But what I need to do is know all that stuff I was describing, my characters, my world, my situations. And then I have discovered that I do my best if I give myself story generating situations. So things are off balance. Somebody wants something, somebody doesn't. There's a random person coming in, messing up the place. I have to give them urgent problems. My tendency is to give them sort of slow, difficult, malaise kind of problems. And what the problem with that in story is then your reader just has a slow and difficult malaise and they set down your book because they're bored. And then you have to ask a lot of questions and then answer those questions, and that has to lead to the next one. Now, the trick here is not to raise a question and then just answer it yes or no, because now your story is stopped cold. However, you can answer your question with a yes, but you got some of what you wanted, but not all of it, or you got it from a different person than you thought. You didn't get it, but you got this other thing. And now you've got something interesting for your characters to react to behave differently. That causes change in their world, and you can start following it. And throughout all of this, you're doing what I always think of as sort of building the dream and staying in the dream, this sort of years-long dream that you have to be able to enter and leave at will. And all of us have a lot of tricks for doing this that work for us. For me, I need to read books that make me want to write, which are different from books I read for fun, which are different from even just my favorite books. It's a really particular thing that sort of lights up my brain in whatever the way. And so I have to kind of keep engaging with those things. Music without words or white noise. A lot of Wine People was written during the pandemic with white noise in my earbuds and other stuff going on in my household, and that was the only way that I could be like, all right, we're just gonna not pay attention to any of that. My best place to write is, I would love to tell you, it's like a beautiful, beautiful window and I gaze out. I always close the window shade whenever I am even somewhere beautiful because I just don't want to see it. And it's for whatever the reason that works for me. And lastly, these little writing rituals that help us manage the brain that is always saying to you, you can't do that, you don't want to do that. Remember how much you hate doing that? And we were just talking before this about the old saw that you should always stop writing one day when you know what you're going to write the next day. And this is very true. I also heard of somebody recently upping the ante to not just stopping, when you know what's next, but stopping mid-sentence. Because my brain is always going to tell me like, oh, you don't want to do that. But even at my least confident, I know I can finish a sentence. And something really interesting happens to me. I noticed at some point along the way when I have a full draft. For me, writing that first draft, because I am by heart a reviser, most of us are either drafters or revisers, I am a reviser because for me, that first part is sort of like digging my way out of prison with a spoon. It just feels so difficult. I never trust that I'm going to get there. And once I finally get to the point where I made the thing, and yes, the thing, it has like 3 heads and sort of half a torso and just some stuff over there, and I don't know what it's doing, but I made it, and now I have confidence that I can fix it. So in that first draft, you're trying everything. You're just sort of lowering all of your standards and questioning nothing. So you send your characters to Nepal, you have them make stupid choices, you do whatever, that's your job. But then the price of that is in the later drafts, you have to start to get analytical. You have to be willing to cut all that stuff that you said, oh, I sent them to Nepal, and then you have to admit yeah, that was good, but not for this, or no, that was actually really bad, good try, but no. And you just have to either adapt it to make it work and analyze why it works for your story or not, or cut it. And you have to be ruthless about that or else this approach just doesn't work. And the real trick of this is to make sure you are not simply changing your manuscript, but actually improving it. And along the way, what should be happening is that you're paying attention to these characters. You've gotten to know them and interesting stuff is happening with them. And so you can learn about them and adapt your plot and their behavior because of what you know about them. So for me, my character Ren, I remember sort of realizing that, yeah, I could think of her as somebody who is just looking for control, but I actually found it more interesting to think of her as somebody who was actually more terrified of being vulnerable. So it's a kind of a nuanced thing, but it did change how she behaved. And with Thessaly, I had to find vulnerability for her. She's a golden girl. So the struggle with being a golden girl is you've never failed. You don't know that you can, and you don't know that you can actually come back from that. Now, there is a very smart but very terrible writing idea that says that at some point you should take all that you know and you set it aside and you start from a blank page. And that doesn't mean that you're throwing out the book manuscript that you've been working on, but you are not trying to fit everything into the old forms. And I have been saying this for years, like, yes, I think that's really a great idea. I know a lot of people do it. And I would not do this. I would do anything in my human power to avoid ever doing this. And unfortunately, what happened was at the very end of the process of writing Wine People, somebody said to me, you know what, these characters need to be further along in their journey so that there are higher stakes for them. And when you make a change to somebody's elemental situation, like making them older, you can't just add that in. You have to redo it. And so after a lot of, very terrible, really feeling upset and just storming around, I finally did it. And I discovered that it actually works really well. It's actually really freeing. And it's a piece of cake once you finally get over that part of your brain that says you shouldn't have to do this. Nobody understands you, blah, 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 blah. Then you do it. And so I did it. And then that begins eventually the next part where it's just the slow turning away from this book. You are stepping out of the dream, you're staying out of the dream longer, and the edits are a little bit lighter and easier, and you're starting to let it be the thing that it simply is going to be. And then you have to start thinking about the next one. So, thank you.
Get the waters arranged here and turn this on. I think that one's yours. Okay, thank you for inviting me. Are we on display yet? Well, it's SoundWaves. SoundWave 2. That's me. That's not me. I guess we were not original in our naming. The plants decide, but are we ready? That's it. So what I have just shown you is a sliver, a tiny, tiny sliver of the biological diversity on the planet. And what I want to convince you of is that the greatest power on the biological power in the biosphere is the creative power of selection. And all of that diversity that you just saw, is a result of mostly natural selection, some artificial selection. There's a little bit of a backstory here as well, which I'll get to in a minute. So let's start off with selection. And I'm a corn breeder. I work on breeding sweet corn varieties. I develop new sweet corn varieties. I've been at UW-Madison for 40 years. And I've actually been working on corn for almost 48. So a lot of my examples are going to be corn-based. So here we see a spike, a female spike of the plant teosinte. And that is the ancestor of corn. And the ancient peoples knew this. As a matter of fact, in the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, teosinte means corn of the gods. So they knew this. The Spanish colonialists came, and they called teosinte madre de maíz. The real question, though, is how did this little thing become that? Did the people 10,000 years ago say, I want that, so I'm going to start here? Of course not. They didn't know that that existed. That came as a result of their selection, their repeated selection where they selected for something better, presumably something that was easier to harvest, something that tasted better, something along those lines. But they selected over and over and over again. People much like this, 10,000, 8,000 years ago, they started with the teosinte here. Let's see if I can, oh, I must have, we lost the show. So I can tell you the backstory. There we go. So again, starting with something like this little teosinte, over probably 300 or 400, maybe 1,000 years, they were getting to something like this, so something very edible and productive. And then after many more years, they got to something like this. We got to something like this, which is actually an era of modern sweet corn. It could be one of my varieties for all I know. And people throughout the hemisphere then, this maize spread through the hemisphere, and all over the hemisphere, people developed their own corn varieties. But they developed by selection. And they really didn't know what they were going to get at the end of the selection. They just knew they wanted something that tasted better, that grew better, that was better in their environment. So they just were selecting based on what they wanted. And when they had things that were good together, they intermated them, and that was the process of selection. And I will add the word recombination with that. The person who's most associated with selection is Charles Darwin. And a very young man, we always see the picture of him with the beard. A very young Charles Darwin got on a boat in 1831, and I've read The Voyage of the Beagle. It's a pretty little leaky boat. None of us would want to spend a long time on that, but he spent 5 years, mostly being sick on the boat because he was very susceptible to seasickness. But he spent a lot of time on the land, probably to avoid the seasickness, but also he observed all sorts of things he had never seen before, including fossils, including animals that he had never even imagined. And this, of course, led later to his thoughts about the origins of species and natural selection, which he didn't publish until 1859, but by 1838 he had all the pieces. You can see here there's a little a tree, a very primitive tree of origin, and over here he did a lot of work with domesticated species, and that makes a lot of sense because in the 1830s, 1840s, English upper class people knew domesticated species. Pigeons were a big hobby back then. So this is where I come in. A little bit of the backstory. I came in as a plant breeder. Plant breeders are trained in selection. I don't generally identify as a geneticist unless I don't want to explain what a plant breeder does. Most of my colleagues don't. It's my feeling that many biologists don't actually understand selection, and they don't understand natural selection. And we'll get to some of the evidence for that in a minute. But I'm going to show you some selection studies that have been done in corn over the years. This is a very famous study, over 100 years of selection at the University of Illinois. They started off with a corn line that had 5% oil, and after 100 years, they got up to 25% oil. Very powerful, very accurate, very precise. In the other direction, they actually selected for less oil, and they ended up having to stop the experiment because there was no oil left. Many of my colleagues, and again, this is where the backstory comes in, say, oh, that selection, that's imprecise, that's slow, that's not random. They use the word random a lot. And as I hope you see from this, there's no randomness there. Those are very precise changes. This is one of my experiments where I worked with something called vegetative phase change. This is juvenile tissue on a leaf, and this is adult tissue on a leaf. And what I selected for here was the last leaf with juvenile wax. This is the juvenile wax. So after only 11 generations of selection, we went from leaf 8 up to leaf 18. We've been doing this for another 10 years, and now we're up to leaf 25. And you can see, big deal for biologists, big deal for many scientists, it's incredibly linear. That's very precise. And again, many of my molecular geneticist friends like, oh, that's just so random, that's crazy, we don't understand it. And they don't understand it, that's the point. And here in the early direction, we went from leaf 8 down to leaf 4. Now this one is a little bit different. This one is another one of my selection studies. And here is a dry ear of sweet corn. Wrinkled kernels, those glassy kernels, that's what sweet corn looks like when the seeds are dry. So those are sweet corn seeds. This over here is what field corn looks like. I mean, that's not really a field corn ear, but that's a starchy ear. That's full of, the kernels are full of starch. As a young, naive plant breeder, I really started this probably in 85 or 86. I said, can I just select for this to become starchy? And my biochemist friend said, no, that is not possible. As a matter of fact, the biochemical hypothesis was that if you had, this is a mutant gene here, if you have this gene, it's impossible to make starch. I didn't know that, and I wasn't a biochemist. So I decided to go for it. And here was the original population, we call it cycle 0. And we had cycle 7 in the direction of extreme sugariness, but I also had cycle 7 in the starchy direction. So after only 7 generations of selection, I had this very starchy ear. I talked to my biochemist friends, and they said, no, that's not possible. You made a mistake. I gave them the ears, and literally at one of the meetings, a woman who became a very good friend of mine, a biochemist, told me she literally cried when she realized I was right, because she did not believe. This was her favorite thesis. Her favorite thing was this: you couldn't happen. And I naively selected for it. The power of selection. This is actually a chart from that data. This is the amount of starch in these kernels, and you can see the starch a little more random, but it still went up dramatically. So it works. Selection works. All of the biological diversity you see around you is because of selection. Let's see in the next one. This is a little more. This is the change in corn yields in the US from 1866 to, I think, 2020. You'll see here that it didn't change very much at all during the first 50, 60 years. And then after a while, it went up dramatically, and that was largely because of economic changes and drive by economic drivers. But how did that happen? Corn breeders didn't know anything about molecular genetics. They didn't know anything about physiology. They selected for yield. How much yield came from a field and went into the combine? That's how they selected. That's all they selected for. This, on the other hand, is the engineering paradigm. If we did genetic engineering, somebody would say, oh, well, maybe if we changed this, we'd get better yields. People have tried this. It doesn't work, I can tell you. So I've been given the signal to kind of wrap up here. So here we see actually US corn yield over years. And here are a number of traits that could change. I've given this test to many people. Most say, oh, we're going to fix photosynthetic efficiency. Or maybe we're going to make water use efficiency better. You can take your bets now. See what changed. Oh no, there we go. Tassel size changed. No one would have thought that, but that's what changed. And it changed because we were putting, well, I can tell you physiologically why it changed ultimately, but it was not something that anyone would have predicted. The point of all this is that all of these changes are made without us understanding the physiology or the biochemistry. Now, I'm not against any of those things. I actually kind of like biochemistry. So here's the key, and this goes back to the title. Plant breeders literally work with plants to find new solutions. The plant breeders apply the selection pressure, whether you're an ancient person from Mayan, what is now Mexico, or you're a modern plant breeder. And what we see is the plants literally find the solution. It's really true. The plants are the ones who are making the choices in how they change. Now, this is to prove my point earlier that my colleagues, the geneticists, don't really get this. A group of geneticists, dog breeders, they weren't breeders, they were dog geneticists. They actually crossed a border collie with a Newfoundland. And the Newfoundland and border collie, as you can see from the picture, but also probably know, very different dogs. They have all sorts of different behaviors, different behaviors, different body language, all sorts of things. You can see the border collie giving the classic hunter's crouch. And the Newfoundlands are just like, oh, what do we care? So they did a study. They crossed them. Then they looked at the offspring from the cross. And they, lo and behold, found that this was controlled by many, many genes. What did they conclude? Literally in the paper. They said, how could these breeders, illiterate shepherds, most of them, have managed to create bit by bit such a sophisticated creature? That's a modern geneticist saying, how did this happen? It couldn't happen because they didn't know what they were doing. Quickly, very close to wrapping up, 2018 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Dr. Arnold, Caltech, she got a Nobel Prize for breeding a new enzyme. She did it by selection. Exactly what I'm talking about. There was one Nobel Prize winner who was a plant breeder, and that was Norman Borlaug, but he didn't get a prize for his science. So, the one last thing I want to say, there's a couple of things. One last thing is that plant breeders also create the future. We always talk to our students about you have to breed for the environment of the future. Well, we actually create the future. What do I mean by that? Well, if I worked for a certain large chemical company that actually sells seed, I might go to my boss and say, I want to breed for improved insect resistance or disease resistance. And that person might say, well, we sell chemicals that will take care of that. So you should do something else. Okay? If I worked for the University of Wisconsin and I say, I want to breed for resistance to insects or diseases, no one's going to tell me not to. So by making that choice, the future is decided. We'll end up with a bunch of susceptible varieties or resistant varieties. So with that, and I have to read something, so have any of you actually read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin? It's pretty tough reading. It's Victorian, but there's a lot of good spots. But I just have 2 sentences to read for you here. And I want to get it right because I think it's pretty beautiful. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner have been produced by laws acting around us. That's the second to the last sentence of Origin of Species. The last sentence is this. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst the planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Thank you.
Dan Graboy is many things. Among them, a voracious reader. And he took it upon himself to be perhaps the only person, other than me, to read all the way through a shuddering thutter of a tome of mine from a few years ago called City of the Good, Nature, Religion, and the Ancient Search for What is Right. So he asked me to speak to all of you tonight about one of its main themes, where the notion of monotheism comes from. 5,000 years and 15 minutes. Let's go. All right. Now, the development of monotheism is likely a relevant matter to most of you. I mean, if you're here tonight, whether you're currently an adherent or not, you were probably raised in a religion commonly considered or called monotheist. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the Abrahamic Big Three are the most common here in Madison. Less current today and less current in our community are Zoroastrianism, Sikhism, Baha'i, Samaritarianism, Manichaeism, Druzism, Yazidism, and Plato's cosmology, what scholars often call Platonism. But it's an awkward category in many ways. Christianity is monotheist? What about the Holy Trinity? And the power of the saints to intercede in human affairs, especially St. Mary, if you pray to them. And after we're done annoying Christians, we can vex Buddhists and Taoists and some varieties of Hinduism about unifying abstract principles like Dharma, the Tao, and Brahman, by which we may attain the good, and proclaim those faiths also as actually monotheist. But let's not make such a nuisance of ourselves. But in addition to category problems, the theology of monotheism is actually never just that of belief in one God or one divine principle. What we often call monotheism usually comes with many other distinctive ideas that are relatively new in human thought. The divine is good. That's one, yep, and therefore impartial and not political. Here's another. The divine is absolute and unarguable. The divine is universal, applying to everyone, for it is the only true divine. The divine is transcendent, abstract, and removed, not immanent and concrete in the here and now. The divine, when gendered, is envisioned as male, not female or non-binary. A few other ideas. Human desire for wealth and sex is the major source of evil and sin in these ideas associated with monotheism. The divine is not swayed, the divine itself is not swayed by wealth and does not engage in sex. And the divine is little concerned with matters of ecology and sustenance. And finally, nature is a problem that needs to be overcome. These are relatively new ideas, you may ask with some wonder. Really? What? Yes. Well, actually, traditions of older origin, traditions yet followed by many, I might add, saw matters quite differently. And had ideas like this, that the divine is actually not necessarily good at all. It's often emotional, unpredictable, and very definitely partial and political. The divine is not absolute and can be argued with, and actually is persuadable sometimes. Different peoples have their own divinities, and that's fine, and it's understandable. The divine is concrete and immanent and can be interacted with directly through idols and other means. The divine can be male or female or non-binary. Wealth and sex, well, they're actually to be welcomed and enjoyed by humans. In fact, divinities themselves enjoy wealth and sex, and they even enjoy sex with humans. And instead of desire, there is sin, but the great sin is disloyalty, not desire. And divinities can be a great help in dealing with the vicissitudes of ecology and gaining our sustenance from an oftentimes resistant world. And nature, it needs to be respected, not rejected, for we are entangled with it. Okay, well, let's focus on the Mediterranean, the Mid-East. Let's consider Ishtar. She's the Sumerian and Akkadian goddess of love and war and fertility. Worshipped at times actually is the most powerful divinity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. And one day, she's being kind and gentle. And the next, she's causing earthquakes and flooding on the Euphrates. Probably because, Dan, insufficient loyalty being shown to her through sacrifices in her temple in the ziggurat, towering over the city of Arook. And she's a sexy goddess. Woo! Beautiful, often horny, and even desiring sex with humans, like Gilgamesh, if you know the Gilgamesh epic, and the gardener Ishulanu. Or consider Zeus, throwing his thunderbolts around. What a hunk! A god hunk. And what a horny god! Horny just like us. In the various Greek myths that have come down to us, he has 23 different sexual partners, both gods and humans, females and males. And if bad things are happening to you, like your crops are failing for lack of rain, maybe try to show a little more loyalty to Zeus and give him some wealth, with a sacrifice of a kid goat or something like that. Then maybe the rain will come. But the Christian divine, now the Christian divine, it doesn't do sex. And God the Father doesn't do money, doesn't do sacrifices. All these stem from desire, and desire is a sin, and the divine is good. Well, plus, the Father and the Son are male. And although she is the mother of the Son, Mary's a saint, not a divinity. Now, yes, Jesus was here on earth for a time, and you can get a sense of his presence, through the cross, which is somehow not idolatry, but anyway. Okay, but while he was here, being the good shepherd of the human flock, he actually never talked about farming. Nope, never. Never talks about farming. Doesn't establish any new holidays or rituals of agricultural sustenance and ecological respect. Yeah, read the New Testament sometime. It's just not there. And actually, he strongly de-emphasizes kinship ties, arguing instead that one's true brothers and sisters are the faithful followers of the Father. Well, what happened? Why this enormous shift in the character of the divine? Well, because religion went to town. Religion went to town, as did more and more people. And starting around 800 BCE, earlier in some places and later in others, an enormous burst of urban growth accompanied an enormous birth of growth in states and empires. This growth had begun earlier during the Bronze Age, most notably in Mesopotamia and Egypt, but these were agrarian cities where most of the inhabitants were still farming. Like the bulk of people at a greater remove in the countryside, like off there in the distance there on that reconstruction. The idea of big and powerful gods that could lead one state in warfare and provide protection made sense, but almost everyone's life still depended directly on sustenance from farming. And organizing all of that through family ties. They still lived pagan lives. That is, the lives of country people. For that is where the word pagan comes from. In the original, in Latin, it just comes from the Latin for someone from the countryside. That's what pagan means. And they followed pagan religions that spoke to those uncertainties and to people's desires for wealth and needs for loyalty to not just the gods, but to the peoples of the gods, especially their own kin. Now, other ideas of the divine had begun to make more sense, on the other hand, as those states expanded and a small middle class developed to administer it. A small middle class that did not farm directly, and that began commanding lower classes to attend to their basic needs at home and on the farms that they often still owned. There were a few experiments like Otanism in Egypt. Maybe folks have heard about that. Around 1300 BCE, Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, proclaimed a single god for Egypt. But it didn't last long, especially when the Bronze Age empires all winked out or took major hits during the Bronze Age collapse in the 1200s. A collapse which is actually still not very well understood. Anyway, the Greek Dark Ages ensued for 500 years, and opportunities opened up, for scrappy little new states and empires, such as that of Israel and its sister state of Judah. But by 800 or so, aided by improvements in writing, and warfare to administer and to enforce wealth accumulation in cities and the class societies that developed in them, major states and empires started building up again. And religion began to change, to speak to these new needs. One universal God that applies to everyone? Check. That's good for empire. Only male divinity for an increasingly centralized, heteropatriarchal, and warlike society? Check. Need to justify what the state is doing in the right of some to substantial accumulated wealth? Well, best to claim it all comes from an impartial, absolute, and non-political divine. Want to protest against that accumulation and power inequality? Well, a God that rejects wealth actually makes sense for that too, if somewhat contradictorily. These ideas, then, are what I like to call not monotheism, but bourgeois faiths, from the Latin for town and city, for that is the context of their origin. Now, in closing, let me say I'm not up here before you to argue that we should all become pagans. Our own context of life is no longer like that of ancient Greece and ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Yet neither do we live fully bourgeois lives, much as we may be encouraged to think we do by the continuing forces of empire and accumulation. And that the fact that the world population is now about 55% urban. Nonetheless, we still depend upon, and will always depend upon, our relations with the non-human world. We eat, we drink, we breathe. We gain our energy mostly from the sun. We live by grace of a complex interaction with that vast diversity of biota. Bill, where are you? Where did he go? Over there, that Bill was talking about. We enjoy and should enjoy a wide range of sexual desires. Bourgeois religions never had that right. But pagan traditions do not speak well to the challenges of social inequality, for they emerged at a time when everyone was only too happy to get a little more security from amid all the precarity. Perhaps we need not pagan faiths that shine with silver, not bourgeois faiths that glitter from gold, but an electrum mix of silver and gold from pagan bourgeois faiths that more clearly speak to the ecological and social fullness of our lives.
Great talk. All right, in 45 minutes, we came from the origin of life to artificial intelligence.
Is there any other kind?
Yes. And if we can bring that up, I will try to convince you that, first of all, what we call artificial intelligence right now is not that intelligent, which is old news for everybody. But there's something deeper in that I hope I will get to at the end. Okay, let's see, can we do that full screen? This is a PDF. Yeah. Close. Yep, full screen mode right there. Thank you so much. All right. So paradoxically, my talk is about monkeys. Monkeys. I think many people have heard of this monkey. It's a famous one. It's known as the infinite monkey theorem. And it says, if you put the monkey in front of a typewriter and let it randomly hit keys, eventually, given enough time, it's going to produce anything that we humans have produced, including all the Shakespeare writings. Okay, so that's the theorem. And I will tell you that, yeah, there's some truth to that mathematically, but it is not how modern AI works. It's close, but not quite. For AI to do this job, our monkey cannot be sitting in front of a typewriter. Instead, it is going to have to play Wheel of Fortune. What do I mean by this? Well, we know the game, right? So there's something a big wheel you can spin, and it will end. Whatever is on top, you get that. Fine. Let's take a look at this wheel. And one thing I really want to point out is there is this $1 million slot. See how narrow it is. Why is it? Well, it's hard to get to, duh. But mathematically speaking, the narrower the slice, the smaller the probability that this slide will be selected. So there's something on this wheel already about probability. Now, you don't have to know anything about probability to know what I mean. Just keep in mind, wider slides, larger chance of getting that, and smaller, harder to get. Fine. Now, our monkey is going to prepare a slightly different kind of wheel. We all know that AI actually reads everything we have posted ever online, anything that's on the internet. Anything you posted publicly can be used by AI. And we can think of that as if this monkey is reading all of the internet. But why is it doing that? Well, it's preparing a wheel. Not this one, but the next. So let me give you an idea of what it means to read the internet. Pretend this is just the beginning of all the documents on the internet. Okay, so there's like gazillions of other documents. And our monkey is going to go in there and just count how many letter A are there. Okay, monkeys are good at counting, so it can do that quickly. But really what we want is not how many A's there are, but what is the percentage of the letter A among all letters that appeared ever on internet. Okay? If you do that with modern English, it's about 8%. 8% of all letters will be the letter A that appeared in publications. And our monkey is going to count all other characters, B, C, up to Z, punctuations, etc., etc. Okay? But for this talk, I'm going to simplify English. I'm going to say, hey, there are only 26 letters plus the white space. So there are only 27 different letters. Our monkey is going to count the percentage of each of those, and it's going to create this wheel. This is the wheel of modern English, and with 27 letters. All right, so you immediately see some things you probably already know, like the letter E is the most frequent, and there are some letters that's really not very frequent and really hard to read. Okay, that's all fine. Now, what would our monkey do? It created this wheel by reading the whole internet. That's a lot of effort. It's going to spin it and see when the wheel stops, what letter comes on top. For the sake of argument, let's say the letter Q happened just by chance. This is how our monkey writes its masterwork. That's the first letter it will write. It will write down the letter Q. And then it's going to spin the whole wheel again, wait for it to stop and see what letter comes up. You're going to be like, really? That's how AI works? Well, we'll get there. If we do that, who knows what will happen? Maybe it's the Z that show up, and that's going to be the second letter the monkey writes. And you will be like, no, this is not even a word. And I completely agree with you. So just bear with me a little bit. We will have a smarter monkey, or actually a richer monkey coming up. One thing that's immediate is the reason you know this is not a word is you know it. Like Z doesn't follow Q. And actually, what usually follows Q? U. We'll get back to that. But let's pretend our monkey just keep doing that and write some gibberish. Okay, so this is our first monkey. Not very satisfactory. However, let's imagine a slightly richer monkey who can afford to acquire 27 more wheels. What do I mean by this? We already saw one wheel. The second wheel is what I call what is after A wheel. The third one is what is after B wheel, and so on and so forth, and until what is after white space. Remember, we have 27 of these things. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that what's after A wheel? I think, actually, hold on. I give you an example of Q. So we're looking at what is after Q wheel. Remember the internet? If you look for the letter Q, you see that here it only appeared 3 times. And it's in equal, requires, and equal. So every time after Q, it is U, obviously. Now imagine this monkey goes on the internet, searches for all Qs, and then it looks for what letter comes after Q. It counts the probability or percentage of letters that will come after Q. Okay? That will produce this kind of wheel. It is predominantly U. There are some other things, like Kdoba, I believe, or some other words that you will have non-U followed by Q. So there's this thing sleeve of other things. Fine. But that wheel is what is after the Q wheel. And similarly, the monkey can count other types of wheels, 27 of them. Let me show you what is after J wheel. Imagine what's after J. It's this in English. It's mostly vowels. Okay? So, the wheels are different, but there aren't too many of them. This richer monkey only has the original wheel plus 27 other wheels. Okay. It can do that by counting the internet, no problem. Now, this richer monkey is going to start by spinning our original first wheel. It's going to, let's say, produce Q again. At this moment, however, it's going to do something different. This monkey sees that Q is produced. It's going to take down the first wheel and put on the what's after Q wheel and spin this wheel, spin the what's after Q wheel. Okay? But we saw what it is like. It's like this big slice of U, so very likely U is going to come up next. That's what will happen. The monkey will very likely get a U. But at this moment, that monkey is going to take down the what's after U wheel, what's after Q wheel, and put up the what's after U wheel, and spin it again. So it's just going to repeatedly do that. Okay? All right, so that's our second monkey. And, could be something like this for the third one, and it's going to, put on the what's after I wheel and repeat forever. Okay. But we can imagine even richer monkey. This monkey can afford many more wheels. And in particular, it can afford 27 times 27, number of wheels. What's going on, right? What are these things? Well, the first one would be what's after AA wheel. That means if the previous two letters are A and A, what letter would come after it? That's the wheel. The second one would be what's come after AB, AC, AD, and so on and so forth, up to the ZZ, and you just enumerate all possible combinations of two letters. Each one would be a wheel. So that's like a whole bunch of them. But the monkey is going to do the same business. It's going to spin the wheel, get the letter, put up that, get the second letter. At that moment, it has two letters. It will take that two-letter combination, say it is QU. It will look for that what's after QU wheel and spin that one, okay? And so on and so forth. Now, for those of you who have seen this mathematics before, what's going on here is this is a random walk. It's a random walk in the letter space, and we're generating a random string, okay? The question is, how good are these? No, they're not good at all. They don't look like Shakespeare at all. Oh, by the way, I'm going to show you like what's after SH. You could see in this particular document, SH appeared this number of times. It is followed by O, I, E, A, white space with different frequencies. Okay, so that's what monkey can do. Anyways, the next big evolution is for the monkey to not use just letters, but it's going to consider English words. It has a dictionary, so it knows what are English words. So going back to the very first wheel, instead of 27 slots, slices, now we have a lot more. You go into the dictionary, start from A, aardvark, all the way down to Zulu. Okay, each one is going to be a slice here. And what I'm actually showing you is the true English frequency of these words. So as we all know, the word the is pretty frequent. Then you get a whole bunch of function words that doesn't mean much. And then you have all those slices. That's where the interesting words are, but they're too small for me to write down what they are. But imagine you have tens of thousands of different slices here. Okay. All right, so that is that. Now, if our monkey actually spins that particular wheel, if it's poor, it can only afford that one word wheel, and it creates sentences. By the way, I should say very carefully what's going on here. This monkey counted all the percentage of words, not from general internet. It came from just Shakespeare books. Okay. And then it spins them and generates random sentences. This is what you would get. To him swallowed, confess here both, which of Savon. You're being like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. It's not even grammatic. That's true, except that what we're seeing here is frequency. Commonly used words by Shakespeare will tend to show up, but in random orders. It's like, you shake the sentences so all the words fall on the floor and they're messed up. It's kind of like this. So that's our first monkey with that one wheel. Now the second monkey, if you recall, it has many, many more wheels. It's like after each word, it has a different wheel. It's going to put up that wheel for the previous word. It spins it to generate the next. If we do that here, you get sentences like this. What means, sir, I confess she, then all swords his trim captain. Now you could say this almost sounds like English, but when somebody is truly drunk or something. Okay, but that's our second monkey. Now if you go to our third monkey, who can afford a lot more wheels, who can basically look at the previous two words and have a special wheel for that, spins the wheel and generates sentences, you get something like this. Sweet princess, Falstaff shall die. Harry of Monmouth's grave. You could still say this is completely gibberish, but it does sound more and more like something. Okay, now why stop at 3? You could have the 4th monkey. That's even richer. That can look at 3 words before it and decide what is the next word, and so on and so forth. So it's only limited by the resources that we have. And this is, in fact, how modern AI more or less generate sentences. Of course, that's not the full story. Our ChatGPT and its friends are much more interesting than this, but this gives you an idea of what are they doing, why are they reading the internet, and how can they say things that's so similar to what we humans would say? It's not that mysterious. Just imagine they are richer monkeys. They have a lot more wheels. They all read the internet. They can generate things because they're spinning the wheel at random. Okay. But of course, there are other details. To me, though, the real fascinating question is this. I believe everybody here has used, GPT or other similar AI chat programs, and we're, kind of both surprised at how good they are and, laugh at how silly they are, right? But we do acknowledge sometimes they sound very human-like in the sense of having a little bit spark of original thoughts, maybe, or can tell interesting stories and so on and so forth. That does make me wonder personally, how different are we in terms of our cognition, in terms of our thinking? Are we so different than these monkeys? I'll leave you at that. Thank you.